Okay, hello everyone. I've been asked to go straight on and chat. My name is Rob Tucker. I'm really inspired by what I was just hearing because my main area of work is working with children who live in families affected by sexual abuse. Either families who have been sexually abused themselves or children who live in families where relatives have or issues to do with sexual abuse. And I also work with child sexual exploitation. Most of my work is working with children who've been abused in family settings and the context of those. So actually I was buzzing as I was listening to that because the parallels were there. However, that is not what I'm here to talk about today. However, saying that, some of you, some of my material will have some connotations to do with sex and sexual abuse and abusive dynamics. And I guess, like many speakers you've had today, my main message is to, statistically in this room, there are people that have been affected by these sorts of things. And this is not a safe enough forum for you individually to be talking about that if you're just at that point. So I guess my main message is take care of yourselves. You've got plenty of sweets, got plenty of water. Get up. I don't mind if you get up and walk out. You need to go and take the loo. If someone does get out, it probably doesn't mean anything to do with that. It just means that they need to use the loo. So take care of yourselves as you go through the day. So I will be making some sort of references a little bit to some of the materials that you've just heard. But my name's Rob. I'm an independent social work consultant. I work all over the United Kingdom and been doing it for quite a number of years now, and worked as a social worker, short-term, long-term, residential, worked in therapeutic teams. I worked for a long time with my mentor, the person who taught me most, a woman called Madge Bray, who worked for a place called Saks. I've met a couple of people in the room who've met her. But I then spent about 12 or 13 years working for an agency called the Lucy Faithfull Foundation. Lucy Faithfull Foundation is an agency that works and specialises in situations of sexual abuse. And I heard Emma talking earlier, talking about working with, and someone asked a question about working with perpetrators. That's what we did at Lucy Faithfull Foundation, particularly in family context, but beyond that. And actually not only do I work with children who've been affected by sexual abuse, but I work with young adolescents who sexually abuse and sexually harm others, including those who get involved in sexual exploitation. So on an individual level, there are people around the UK who do the individual level, but I totally agree with Emma. It's a really an area that we haven't really touched in working with those at the outset in terms of the perpetrators. I also work with prepubescent children with sexual behaviour problems. I might have met some of you in the past who have come up and done some Stop It Now stuff around sexual behaviours in prepubescent children and what's normal and what isn't, and doing work on that. So if I have, be nice to see you later. But today, I was asked to come here, not to talk too much. Really, it's going to give you an opportunity to do some activities, to do some stuff. You can see you've got some pens and paper. I'm actually passionate about this communicating with children, and it's World Social Work Day today, and there are going to be some links to some of the presentations you've heard today. I could put up a list like this. I'm going to be a nightmare for the cameraman because I never stand still, so I'm going to be walking around all over the place. So apologies for some of you as I'll come over, because you must be neglected over the corner there, so I'll come and wave to you as we talk. But you can put up a load of stuff on the screens that tells us, can we communicate with children? I do communicate with children all over the country, and the message I hear from social work profession, people like myself, is the dilemmas and the stresses and the strains of the job and the time limits and the difficulties engaging and the very real dilemmas that you find yourself in. Often people saying they haven't got the time. My point is you haven't got the time to do all the other stuff, because there is no way we can do any parts of our job without communicating with children. I'm speaking to the converted, I'm sure here. But it is the area that gets whittled down in terms of resources, in terms of time. You heard Emma talking about relationships with therapists and with workers. Well, I'm a passionate believer. It comes down to the relationship. It comes down to that individual relationship, and that does take time, and it does take effort. But of course, you're working in a system where sometimes, we're pressured to do assessments within 28 days, or we've got to make a decision quite quickly. And they're the dilemmas and the pulls that we've got. But we know from the various research and the inspections is that the two main fundamental recommendations you get in most of the childcare serious case reviews and child deaths is, one, professionals haven't talked to each other enough, but the other is we haven't communicated with children. I usually get called in to do the training I usually do with communicating with children is 2 or 3 day courses. They're quite in-depth things. I usually get called in to do those, usually a year after a child death. Because one of the recommendations is communicating with children. Now, I'm fortunate, there's lots of authorities around the country who value it and they put a lot of effort in, but some of us have to ask the question, how much input did we get in our training in terms of the actual basics of communication skills and forming relationships. Some of you are lucky enough to have, but it is an absence in our training, but we do it despite that. But I mean, you've heard from Emma and from others today about some of the reasons that children don't talk. And I'm not talking here about how perpetrators, because I could go on for ages about perpetrators and how perpetrators group. And there are very different methods that are used in family contexts as are used in child sexual exploitation. A variety of different methods, some similar, some different. But I'm putting up here some of the ways in which children are silenced. It's sometimes because of how we respond to it. Have we listened? And of course, I don't want to already wind you up saying that we don't listen as a profession, but sometimes we're not. Some of the serious case reviews is we haven't written the child's words. We haven't written what they've said. We've actually misinterpreted sometimes, or it's our interpretations of what it. And some of the reasons we have a hard time at court is because, you know, clever counsel have pointed out that how do we know that they've said that at the time because we haven't made a note of it. Are you sure you said that? Yes, I wrote it down within an hour. After I did the visit. Well, how do we know that actually they said it in that words? How do we know those words are exact when you wrote it down in your car outside? Other cases been thrown out on the basis of social workers giving an accurate report of what they heard, but if we haven't written it down and we haven't actually reported it. So one of the things, the reason I get passionate about communicating with children, not only is it fun, it's what I came into the job to do, but also it's about watching our backs and being clear, and it's also about ensuring that the children's futures are protected, and that Emma was talking about having access to files. How much access to files? How accurate are some of the things we write in files? You know, are we writing files with the notion that a child is going to be reading that stuff, and actually later when they're adults, we would be considering some of this stuff. Now look, I'm trotting out the old triangle that comes out in every single training course. Most of you have been at social workers, the Common Assessment Framework, and this is the basis. I was involved in the piloting of this in Shropshire, working as a social worker in Shropshire many years ago. And I remember saying at the time, this flaw in the system of the Common Assessment Framework and the core assessment process was that it didn't really take account of children's wishes enough in it. And I'm asking this question now, as I did then. When you write, those of you who work in social work who do the assessments, when you do assessments on these areas, and you have, I don't know, you have little boxes to do with each area, is the child's words quoted in every single box in your Common Assessment Framework? Or is it just that little box at the end that says child's views and wishes? Because my view is, if we're only recording the child's views at an end of assessment, it's not a child holistic assessment, it's a parenting assessment. Because often we're getting the views of professionals and we're getting views of the others. So the challenge to us all, and I put my hand up, many years I was working as a social worker and I wasn't actually getting the views of children, it wasn't integrated within the work. But actually, so my question to people in our job is, do we actually get all that? Because we can ask a child about housing, we can get a child's view about the parents' work, about the parents' money. Are we recording those things as a matter of course? And my view is that we should be. Now, in a way, we could be saying, you take the triangle, and many of you have probably seen loads of versions of this all over the country. You've got a variety of versions of child-centred sort of approaches to the Common Assessment Framework. This is one that I tend to use, is that you've got all these areas, but we change the words, and I change the words when I'm talking to a child. We could be talking healthy, it could be talking about looking after yourself, depends on the age of the child you're pitching it. But are we, and this is one that I often use and workers use with children when we're trying to gather information. It's what I call the quick method to doing an assessment. And we're going to do something around this in a moment, something very quick to make a point. But my point about communicating with children is that actually talking to children is one of the worst ways to get information from children. It can be a very effective way. But actually, we're also working with children who've been traumatised. Many of the children that you're working with, there's allegations of the concerns about trauma. We've heard about that this afternoon, and actually Clark this morning was talking about attachment. Attachment's a form of trauma in terms of the attention. And we know the implications of trauma on children. One of the things we know from a lot of the work on the neurological work's been done is that the parts of the brain that are most affected by trauma are the parts of the brain that effectively are dealing with verbal memory. So what do we do with children who've gone through trauma? As on my old job, because I used to love doing it, I'm trained in the Achieving Best Evidence, what used to be called the Memorandum of Good Practice, interviewing children in suites and actually trying to get them to give their testimony on evidence. So we take children into a room, we sit with someone who they don't really know, we sit them on a chair, they've got cameras in the room, as we got at the moment looking at them, and then what do we need to do in order to get their evidence? We ask them questions. The very thing we're trying to access, the part of the brain that is least likely to be affected or least likely to access because of trauma, the verbal memory part of the brain. Actually, the part of the brain that's less affected by trauma is the visual memory part of the brain. Hence, one of the reasons, one of the best ways in which we're communicating with children whose brains may be affected by the long-term trauma is, why don't we draw a picture of it? But as a profession, we become so scared for something that happened, 15, 20 years ago in Cleveland. We're afraid of certain techniques with children because we're wondering whether or not they're evidentially safe. And of course, we've got to do things that are evidentially safe, but actually doing things like drawing and talking to children to supplement the ways that we hear is really important. But you see, we know that children who've been traumatised have a variety of coping mechanisms. Emma was talking about the fact that actually about some of the things about the or Clark this morning, what is the function of attachment behaviour? What purpose does it serve? And in a way, it's the same here, is that we should be, what purpose is their coping mechanisms? A lot of these coping mechanisms, these are, what you see up there is denial, projection, minimisation, vagueness, scratching themselves, not talking, going in on themselves, not feeling or being too expressive. These are all very clever and functional things. It's the child's clever brain is doing a really good job of keeping the adults away. But you've got to communicate with a child who may be showing all these things. And you may have to do that to get a report within 12 days, or to build a relationship, or a child is running away and you've only got limited sort of opportunities to try and reach and get in and engage with that child. And then this is why many of you, in terms of social work, many of our jobs are pressured by the trauma of the event. The system is trying to form the relationship. And actually, that's one of the reasons when I started off doing it, was doing play therapy and doing therapeutic play work with children, spending many hours forming the relationship. But of course, I was then going out, and I've got some with me, showing puppets, doing puppet shows, showing people how I engage with children, which is great. But when I was training with social workers, are they going to be doing that the next day? So often over the last sort of 15 years, it was about the development of techniques that were quick, and the ones were engagement tricks. But you're going to hear me talk about later is that a tool, an activity, is only a trick. Actually, the trick won't work unless we deal with what we bring to it in ours, and we're going to talk a bit about that as well. Can't really go into that in depth over an hour, but we're going to do that and give you plenty of time to do. My message, I guess, is that the normal methods of communication with children that you're often dealing with don't work with traumatised children. You know it. I could ask you all, you're a big group, I'll ask you, where is the place you get most of the information with children? And often people will come back to me and say, in the car. And of course, what do we do with children that we go into counselling, or what do we do with children? We go into video suites, we get our chairs out, we sit them on chairs. If I'm a really good counsellor, 45-degree angle, I sit there and I get into my counselling position and I do my, and I am taking the mick a little bit, but it's valid. But often the worst thing we're doing when we're communicating with children is looking at them, looking in their faces. Well, actually, the best way is to be side on, or to be at right angles. Is that many of the rules in communicating with children we have to turn on their heads when we turn. And of course, the methods of children communicating is often toys and play. I learned that very early on from Madge Bray, was about learning how toys can connect with emotions and how they can connect and get past defences in very effective ways. But I mean, we've got to be thinking about different ways of altering our communication. And you're going to have a bit of an activity to do today. Which is, some of you are going to find it's rather simplistic, but I do think over the years, the more I've done communicating with children, the more experience I got, and I know many of you in the room, with communicating with children, the more I've found I'm going back to the simpler techniques I've got. Actually, it's a simple thing that I can do most of my work with one pen and paper, with most kids. And actually engagement. But there are some children where you have to use other ways of doing and communicating with children. And you've got to, it's not ideal coming along, wearing a nice shirt, when I've got my jeans on, but probably not on the floor and you're not seeing it. But sometimes it is about doing little things. It's sort of doing little things that the younger children wants to. Oh, he's scared. Oh, he's a bit scared. Oh, what's that? Yes, they are weird, aren't they? They're very weird. What's that? He wants to come and say hello. Just wants to say hello. It's all right, say hello. Oh, no.
thought he was going to bite you, didn't you?
Thank you. And you see, I could use that because I could get into, we're going to come and say, oh, you don't know who she is yet. You don't know her, do you? No, you can't let people stroke you, can you, until you have a conversation. What was that? He wants to know what your name is.
Jackie.
Jackie, your name's Jackie. He said, do you know what his name is?
No, I don't.
His name is Rufus. What's that? Because we see lots of children, don't we, Rufus? Yeah. And actually we do lots of thinking and talking about their worries, don't we, and their muddles, and his brain goes up and down, and he does lots of talking, because we go and see lots and lots of children who've got lots of worries and lots of muddles, don't we? And some of the children, they've got worries about not living at home, and some of the children have got worries about, what's that? Oh, they've got hurting worries, and they've got touching worries. Oh, and I'm often talking to children, even when I've had that introduction with younger children, often within the first 2 minutes, I got worries too, I got touching worries, Mum and Dad did that to me, Mum. And actually, most of the material I get from younger children about sexual abuse, I usually get in the first 5 minutes. But with older ones, you'd have to have a totally different message. But I'd also have to think, is this evidentially secure? Can I use this in an investigation? Is it later? It's a complicated matter, this. But I mean, what's that? Oh, he's got a bit of a worry. He's going to whisper in your ear and tell you the worry. You've got to listen very clearly. He's going to tell you a little worry. It's only a little worry. Did he tell you his worry? Yeah. What did he tell you?
He's scared of all this lot.
He said he's scared of all this lot? Yeah. It's a puppet.
That was mine.
Doesn't talk. Look, if you can do that with adults, just think about sometimes the way we can do it with kids. We get drawn in. I can't do my Babaloo, but my Babaloo is a string puppet. You have to see it, and it's on the floor. I can't do it here. If there's a stage, I'd do it. But I mean, I guess my point is, we have to learn and think about. I'm passionate about puppets. Doesn't mean you have to be. Could be pens, could be paper, could be Playmobil toys. It could be any way of doing it. My point here is that we've got to think of alternative ways of communicating with children and build up our skills. And we're going to do that a little. And I'm going to give you some of the basics. We're going to do something on activities. But before we do, I wanted to show you this. Now, you can't all see the writings. I'm going to read it out, but I'm making a point here. This is a young child that I was working with, Kevin. He's age 7. I've got to see where I can find it. Sorry, I'm going to find it up here. This is Kevin. I'll read it out. And I was working with Kevin because he'd been coming to care because of issues of neglect. But once he was in care, in foster care, then a lot of information came out about the children's sexual behaviour with siblings. And then we got brought in, and some of my colleagues were interviewing the adults, and I was doing some of the work with the children. My point about this is that when my colleagues went to see the adults, and they were talking to the adults about the sexual behaviour all the children were engaging in and talking about, then the message in the assessment was, didn't happen in our house, must have been since they'd gone into care, never happened. And of course, the thing about an adult-dominated assessment is that you've only got the sources of information is the adults. And it can be, the danger is, if we don't listen to the voices of children, the assessment becomes preoccupied with the adult agenda in the reports. But when I saw the children, and we did this simple drawing, this is Kevin drawing his brother Mark, and he's saying, Mark is naughty, he's been having sexing with Hannah. And if you notice on this, if those of you can see it, I put a quotation mark. This is my handwriting, by the way. Quotation mark to show what he spoke. Actually, my question in relation to what I wanted to know the X, I've underlined. How do you know is what I asked, which is actually evidentially secure. It's not a leading question. And he said, I saw them in Hannah's room on the bed. Dad came in and see them do it. I told Dad to come up here and help me. Hannah's his sister. Then what happened is my question. Dad slapped Mark on his bum and said, go to bed. Dad said, go to bed, you naughty boy. Mark is good. He's good now. He's got funny hair. I play in the park and I play football with him. My point about this is that the child has given us a totally different account of what took place in the family. We did lots of other drawings to actually be clearer about what it was. But the adults gave me a view. It didn't happen. The children are beginning to talk about sort of touching that's happening. And the point is that my colleagues could then go back to the adults and put that to them and counter. And we could, when we went to court, we could put the fact that there were alternative points of view and they contradict each other. Now, I did this nearly 13 years ago, 12 years ago. I was called into court with this last year. This lad, who's now 7, no, not 7, Mark, who was 15, is now a parent. And they called me back because they're saying, well, he was involved in sexual harmful behaviour. He's a danger to his kids. Of course, my answer was, you can't do a risk assessment on an adolescent and make it, the recommendations of an adolescent. I did the assessment on the adolescent. It doesn't last more than 2 years because they grow out or they change. And I said, I can't make any judgment about whether he's a risk. But his point in court was, I never said that to Rob. I never told him about it. But of course, my point was, when I went to court, I couldn't remember what he told me. It was 12 years ago. I remember the case. I can't remember the words. But I was able to get out my pictures. I was able to show exactly what the words were saying because I recorded them, because I wrote them down on the picture, and because I actually safeguarded myself 12 years later against the evidence that I first got 12 years ago. What would be the problem about writing it all down? You're not looking at the child. And actually, that problem is one of the most important strengths, and the best things you can do when you communicate with children is not look at them too much. Because actually, by looking down at the piece of paper, side by side, doing a piece, but also you've got them in peripheral vision, and you're giving them lots of, is actually taking that stress off, and actually you're less likely to get their denial strategies to go up, and we know with the visual stuff. But there's also another advantage. If they've got a pen and they're writing down, they can stop. They can decide not to tell you stuff. They can decide, because when you talk to people, they're so afraid it's all going to burst out, young people, because you don't know where the information's going to go. A lot of people are either going to close in or it's all going to come out in anger. Whereas actually sometimes we've got to slow the pace down for young people. I mean, I'm a great believer in spending ages to get this information from children, but you might only have an hour, half an hour, to get this information for a report. I'm talking here about those situations where you've got very little time to build up a relationship. I'm not saying that you get all the information from doing this, because actually this should be an ongoing process that goes on during the relationship of the child. But you are, many of you, having to write reports, write things about a child and make decisions that are feeding in, and you do as best as you can to get the information you can. Now, some kids give me loads of information when they do this, but it's not terribly child-centred, is it? Actually, this is an adult-dominated approach to the work. We've got our adult words and our adult little boxes on our adult little computer that we're filling in, and we're going to ask the child to make sure we've got our adult information. I'm not adverse to that. We need it. It's an agenda that's important. But it's not always the best way of communicating with children. And that some social workers and some workers love using this because it's clear, it's direct, they go in, they do it on a big piece of wallpaper, they can spend 20 minutes and they get virtually a quote on every single area of your assessment that contributes into the decision making. And that's a really effective way. But if you've got a child who isn't terribly easy to engage, who doesn't like writing, who doesn't sit down still very well, or doesn't do things for very long, you've got a problem. There is no way in a million years that you can use 50 minutes of time to talk to people about communication skills and engagement in any great depth. Spend days doing about it. My brief was, end of the day, get you doing something. That was basically it. Because you were actually, I mean, although having heard the last, speak, you were engaged and electrified, but often at this time of day it can be quite hard work, and it was to get you to do something. That was my brief for today. But in a way, I was thinking, well, what message can you give over? You could spend 20 minutes doing that one activity and you probably would have found out more about your partner from any other conversation you've had before. Or you might have found out what they didn't tell you. But I haven't given you that time to do that. I've deliberately chosen to give you 2 very short 5-minute slots. The message here is about there are plenty of techniques that we can use that are very imaginative activities we can use with children. Loads of books out there, loads of people reading. You're going to go away with a pack, and all these things that are in your packs are in these blues. They're all described in a pack that's going to be left. That's going to be emailed to you. You've got a pack on techniques that's going to be there. But my point is how much information you can get very quickly from a child if you think about the activity and do something written down. But the other message is, how many of you, these are simple techniques, many of you in this room have got loads of experience doing this stuff. You've seen lots of this stuff before, eco maps and family trees. But ask yourselves, how often do we write it down on the picture? There's a reason I was getting you to write it down. Let's imagine you were called back in a year's time to give evidence about your partner. How much are you going to remember? Let's imagine you now went out the car and wrote it, which is what we call contemporaneous notes, that legally is you have 24 hours. That's a very good period to do it. You'd be doing it fresh in the mind. How accurate would you be? Did that child said, "Daddy hit me," or "Daddy nearly hit me"? Did you get the nearly written? Did you remember the nearly? Did you remember that they said, sometimes I think Daddy might, or did I say sometimes Daddy did? Do you remember the exact words that were used when you were sitting in that table compared to when you go outside? The point is, as workers, as social workers, we get lambasted in the press, we get a lot of pressure on us. And we're here to celebrate social work, which is about, what is the biggest skill of social workers? You're nosy. That's our skill. We're nosy. We ask questions. We get in places. We get into places where they don't want us to get into. And then we ask lots of questions. We build relationships. And of course, the key of it is building a relationship with children. Well, if we're building a relationship with children, we're getting information with children, we've got to make sure that we are writing stuff down that is accurate. Not all the time. I'm not asking you to write every single word down. But actually, if we only wrote down the bit that said, Daddy hit me, and we only wrote that down, that's bias. Because the child is all, because if I was a barrister, and I noted the only thing you wrote on the child was Daddy hit me, then actually the message you're giving to the child is that's all the information you're interested in. So every conversation they have after that, I could get thrown out of court on the basis of that you've given the child a bias of saying you're only going to write down things about when Daddy's been nasty to you. If you'd have been, if the child had said Daddy loves going for a walk, and you wrote that down, and you wrote down I like greens, or I like liver. Well, you never find a child does that, but you write those down. Then the child is, you're writing down less important information. When it comes to writing down about the bruise or the situation, the child is not so surprised by it. They're already used to you writing stuff down. And actually, children don't, we as adults think, is that going to get in the way of talking? Well, actually, it does the opposite. Encourages the child to talk. If you're saying, that's really interesting, I want to write that down. And actually, we're leaning over and we're doing it with them and we're getting engaged with them. Children's reports of this is they've find it much difficult if we're sitting writing out on a notepad. They can't see what we're writing, they can't see it, they can't change it, they can't make an error, change the errors that you got. And I guess one of the things is the methods of communication. Here's some simple examples of some of the stuff you've got that I've used. You can't read this because it's too far away. But a simple little thing that's in Pack's unfinished sentences. The girl here, for example, there's all these sentences that I started and then she finishes and she writes it. I like my mum. I would not like to live without a big family. I hate it when I'm grounded. I feel silly when I do stupid things. I get angry when people stare at me or take the piss. I'm very good at being cheeky and art. I wish people were butting in our business. That means us lot. I was very happy when I went home from care. I think fathers are okay. I like it when I go out with my friends. My stepdaddy's a fucking paedophile. I wish I could do what I want. My daddy's a cunt. In the middle of this very simplistic exercise, you get some very significant information. And sometimes it's about giving them something. What I learned was, it's not about dragging these children kicking and screaming into our adult worlds. We've got to open the window, open the door, and we've got to give them a chance to walk through. And sometimes giving them different activities, be it a worksheet, be it a conversation, be it an activity, be it a piece of drama, is we're giving children the opportunity to connect. We don't know which one's going to connect with the child, but we've got to have with a variety of activities. Sometimes just draw a picture of yourself. This lad is communicating without words, really. This child, I draw a drawing of himself. He's drawn a drawing of himself, pointed to suicide. I think he communicated with me pretty effectively without opening his mouth. Simple things. They've got wonderful, lovely, complicated drawings in some of these books. I've found over the years, the more simple the drawing, the more information you'll get. Here's one of my worksheets. Feelings I have had. And angry. And draw a picture right about time you felt angry. An 8-year-old boy, he's drawn it, and I've written on it, this is me being very angry when I was taken away from mum. I'm angry at the foster carers because I didn't want to be there. Sometimes when I'm angry, I didn't talk to people. Sometimes I didn't eat. Actually, this lad was showing a whole lot of behaviours that everyone went on about being trauma as a result of abuse. Most of his behaviours as a result of separation from his mum. But the word loss never entered the report that I saw on this lad. But you can have other ones, feelings I've had when I'm sad. Look how much information you can get. It starts from the right. This is me being taken away by mum because daddy was bad. He did bad touching to Shay. They took me away. He doesn't do it to any of us. He didn't do any bad touching to me. Someone rang the doorbell and people barged in. Police were there. There were lots of cars out the front. They told me and others to come with them. When they know they were taking us away, we said no. We are behind Natalie. And they grabbed us, put us in a car. We got taken to the new foster care. And I was mixed up. Children have a lot to say. But we've got to provide them. There's a whole lot of, I'm not going to show you them all, a whole variety of different drawings that we can use with children. This is a 6-year-old child drawing a worry bag. And in a worry bag, she's got mum shouting at me, dad shouts at me, and mum and dad tickled my toot. It's amazing how children communicate. But actually most of this is irrelevant unless we get the process of communication. I'm just going to miss a few here because I'm running out of time. But for me, the most important thing I've ever learned over 30 years of communicating with children, the technique is useful, but really it's about what we bring into it. And what I learned from my colleagues and what I learned over years, time for you and time. Time for you is time when I spend some time with you. You can talk about and do whatever you want to. I'll just be here with you. I'll spend time with you. Time for me, later on we're going to have some time for me, and time for me is where I've got to ask you some questions. Now I've got an agenda. I've got to ask the child things to do a report. But the biggest mistake we make as workers is when we go in and ask the questions within 2 minutes of meeting them. We should be actually getting to know them a little, and we should be getting the process. So in some of the handouts you've got is a whole thing about the process. I think what I'm hoping you'll take away is that as social workers, this is what we should be doing, and it's what we do, it's what the skills are. But I hope when you're thinking about future and communicating with children, when you're making decisions about staff you're working with, when you think about communicating with children, for me, communicating with children is the most important course we should be doing. We should be taught because everything else is supplementary to doing the work with the children. And when we're thinking about it, technique is one of the things we do. But we should also have courses that make us think about what our agendas are, what we want, what our biases, how do we use our bodies, how do we use our words, how do we ask questions in evidentially safe ways. But also you need courses that give you a chance to practice. Doesn't matter whether you're very experienced or not, is that we still need chances to learn from each other. So I hope that in the future that one of the things from today is to say, you know, it's World Social Work Day. One of the things I've noticed, I'm coming to a conclusion, one of the things I've noticed over the last 15 years is the time with children is getting squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. And actually the people that are doing the best work with children, family support workers and projects, are the real skillful people in terms of working with. But often they're the ones that are suffering lots of experience and cuts. But I've been in some parts of the country where the family support workers are doing all the work, but they're not allowed to go to court to give evidence about the children's stuff. They have to do it through the social worker. What does that say when we minimise the child's voice in the court setting? So I'm hoping that when you know, at the end of thinking about children, I'm passionate about the work. I know that there are people talking here and you've got lots of activities. Keep passionate, keep going. It's really difficult. Some of my job is to keep people sort of good, sort of getting excited. Make sure that everything you do has got the child in it. And I know that's been a theme this afternoon. I heard bits this afternoon about participation and everything else, is keep that passion flowing. I'm conscious that you've had a busy day and we're about to switch up, so I'll hand over and we'll finish the day off for you.